All right, picking up where we left off on this chapter on reasoning and problem solving, we are now moving into the problem solving, and we're going to go back a little ways here to some older ideas, but basically some approximately first half of the 20th century here, to talk about the Gestalt approach, and then we'll kind of move into some more recent work. But we're going to talk about this for a couple of reasons. One, of course, it's historically important, but uh, one thing is that a lot of the research methods on problem solving that have been very influential derive from what the Gestaltists were doing. So we want to understand what they were doing. But also, this distinction on different types of problem solving strategies, if you will, or categories of problem solving reasoning are relevant not just for this chapter, but also for the upcoming chapter on intelligence. Because as we look at intelligence, we're going to have to understand what it is, and that might involve defining it in terms of problem-solving skill. And so, of course, things we say about problem solving are relevant to that. And we're going to see that when we think about different types of intelligence, we're not going to use terms like reproductive thinking and productive thinking, but we might use terms like crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. And one thing that I want you to maybe try to remember when we get to that chapter is the somewhat obvious parallel in the definitions here a little bit. So let's define these. Reproductive thinking here is defined as rote memory. What does that mean? Rote means routine, right? So that means that I can simply memorize a bunch of facts and information and regurgitate that later. We may all be familiar with that approach to studying for exams, right? That means we are simply just reproducing some basic facts and information that we have learned, right? Another version of this, though, is that when it comes to solving certain kinds of problems, we've talked about other kinds of problem solving approaches like well-defined problems like arithmetic. And so the one approach to that is pure memorization. It was not uncommon, also in the early 20th century, by the way, for children in school to have to memorize multiplication tables, for example, right? And so that meant answering questions on a math test like that would be pure rote memory, right? But a variant of that is I can learn and memorize the algorithm for how to perform multiplication by hand. So that way, if I give you a math problem such as multiply 17 times 24, I've made that up and I don't know the answer. Um, you might not have memorized the answer, but you have memorized a procedure that allows you to calculate the answer with a pencil and paper, right? So that's a form of reproductive thinking as well. You have that procedure, and you can apply that procedure to solve a specific kind of problem where you have memorized the fact that that procedure solves that kind of problem, right? Distinguish that from productive thinking, which is more about solving novel problems, right? So that means that I can give you a problem to solve that you've never been taught how to solve, but you might be able to figure out how to do it. So that means you're not just regurgitating information that you've memorized, right? That's not going to help you here, right? You have to be a little more flexible, and you're going to need some novel solution, right? And that means you have to generate a novel solution. And that's why it's called productive thinking, because you are producing a novel insight here. I also label this as abstract thought in a way because here what we're talking about is I memorizing a fact and repeating that fact later can be a fairly concrete activity. But imagining the possible solution to a problem that's not been solved before is more of an abstract kind of a situation. It's a what if kind of situation here a little bit. Now let's look at what the Gestaltist had to say about this productive thinking and the concept of insight. And it begins actually with some animal research. Wolfgang Kohler was studying chimpanzees at the primate research station. And one of the things that he did is that he would give them problems to solve. Namely, he would take some food, some bananas, and he would place it in their enclosure, but place it in such a way that they could not easily obtain it, right? Maybe it was hanging high up on a canopy that was out of reach, or it was behind some slots in a kind of a wooden cage-like structure where it was too far away for them to reach their hands through the bars of that cage to get it. But maybe they could fashion some sort of an instrument that would allow them to reach further or to climb higher to get this food that was hanging from a high canopy. And considering the context of the time, where in this era behaviorism was certainly an emerging dominant theme in psychology, we might try to imagine what would a behaviorist say about problem solving like this. And their claim is that behavior is all just about a simple stimulus response relationship. And of course, maybe emphasizing the importance of reinforcement and punishment and so forth. So the idea here is that high-level complex planning of a behavior would not be something that occurs. Rather, an animal would perform a response, and that response would be followed either with reinforcement. They get the food, and therefore they repeat the response, or it's followed by either no response, right? So if there's no consequence to their action, then that means that they don't repeat it, or maybe even it's followed by a punishment, right? A negative outcome, in which case they're, again, less likely to repeat that behavior in the future. So over time, their problem-solving behaviors are shaped by patterns of reinforcement and punishment. But that's not what Kohler found. What Kohler found, and let me just go to the pictures here, is that the chimpanzees appeared to, well, first they would notice, okay, the food's hanging high up from the canopy. We can't reach it. They might jump up and down and try to, see if they can jump high enough, and that's not going to do the job. And then they would stop and do nothing. And then, as we can see here, one or two of the apes have figured out to stack these crates. And the way this played out is that after jumping up and down and realizing that they couldn't jump high enough to reach the food, they essentially stopped and did nothing. And then what happens is, after some period of time where they are doing nothing, one of the apes, or maybe two of them, just get up and stack the crates and climb the stack, and then they are able to reach the bananas here. This would suggest not a behaviorist explanation where they might just try various responses without knowing what's going to happen and hope that one of them is a lucky stumble on the correct answer, in which case they get reinforced. But rather, it appears as if the apes who were doing this had this moment of insight, right? That this sudden realization that, oh, this is how to do it. This would suggest a form of productive thinking happening in the chimpanzees here. Here's another example where they have to reach behind this cage-like structure, and here we see a chimpanzee fashioning some sort of a probe by putting two sticks together to make a probe long enough to reach the food behind those slats. Or in another case, one appears to have sort of discovered pole vaulting, I guess, and again is using that to reach a high height. And so again, all these examples are productive thinking here. It's not just random trial and error learning, trying various things until the correct response is reinforced, but rather it appears to have been the result of that insight moment where suddenly the solution just occurs to one of the chimpanzees, and then they perform the response out of apparent thin air, right? The answer just comes to them. We have many more modern examples of animal problem solving where we see similar examples of productive thinking, right? So in this research, some food is hidden at the bottom of a small plastic tube, and we have a crow whose beak is not long enough to probe down the length of that tube to recover the food. But there is a small loop tied around this container, and the crow has figured out how to bend a wire to make a hook and to use that to pull the loop up and to extract the food this way, right? So they weren't taught how to do this. They didn't go through a series of steps of reinforcement. They simply appeared to discover this method, and it works. Below, we have elephants here. So what happens is that we have this tray that has baskets of food on it, but it's behind a barrier, so the elephants cannot get to it directly, and their trunks are not long enough to reach through and get it. So what they need to do is they need to pull the rope to pull the tray up from under the barrier into a position that's easier for them to reach. But the challenge here is that if only one elephant pulls the rope, then that rope will slip through these tubes that are mounted to that tray. So you have to have both elephants pulling at the same time. And again, we see that they spontaneously figure this out. Now they're showing problem solving that involves teamwork here. So both elephants have to make this realization. Productive thinking in groups. We're seeing it even in simpler animals. In bees, here we have, if you look at these blue circular discs, these are small trays that have a small amount of food located at the center of the disc. And the bee cannot get it, but they're covered by a piece of plastic. It's kind of hard to see in the picture. But what's happening here is that the bee cannot get under this plastic to get at the food. But there are little cotton strings there. So if the bee pulls the string, it can pull that disc out from under the plastic cover and then it can get to the food. So, of course, bees figure this out. But also critically, other bees that are watching this happen figure this out a whole lot faster than bees who have never watched another bee do this, which suggests actually also another form of kind of social learning. And given how social bees are as insects, that would kind of probably be a relevant kind of cognitive ability for bees to have. We see it in ants here. So what we're looking at here is a pathway. So if you look at the bottom left of this figure, there's a point that corresponds to the ant's nest. And we see a worker ant go out, and it's kind of following a very irregular outbound trajectory, and it's exploring the environment, and it's looking for food. And I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, this is sort of an off-topic commentary, but maybe I'll mention it just for fun, and you can look into this if you want to. I wouldn't be surprised if these outbound exploratory trajectories have a fractal structure and pattern to them. So that would be an interesting discovery, I think. Leaving that aside for the moment, then, what happens is that eventually the ant may discover a source of food in the environment. But what happens is that after the ant has discovered the food, and it's going to want to do a couple of things, right? It wants to take some food back to the nest, but it may also, of course, want to signal to other ants back at the nest where the food source is. So it's going to leave a trail as it does so, a chemical trail that provides a direct path to the food. So, of course, it needs to turn around and take a straight line path back to the nest, right? One thing it doesn't want to do, not very efficiently, would be to retrace its steps, right? And follow that same convoluted, curvy path all the way back to the nest. And of course, we find evidence that that's exactly what the ant does. It manages to turn around and walk straight back to its nest. So that's called path integration, that integrating along the many twists and turns of its outgoing exploratory trajectory, it can still determine the direction straight back to the nest. And as further evidence of this, one variation of this experiment found that if you take the ant that has discovered the food source and displace it, meaning if you pick it up and you move it, say, several feet over in one direction to the right, so that's the arrow showing displacement and release, it still follows the same kind of pathway that normally would take it back to its nest, and that's the red line here labeled return trajectory after displacement. But now what happens, of course, is that by the time the ant gets back to where the nest ought to be, we start to see a little bit of confusion happening, right? That kind of random squiggle of a nest searching behavior, because what this reveals really is that the ant had an expectation even that this is where my nest ought to be. And now they are a little alarmed, perhaps, say, oh my gosh, my nest is gone, right? But the idea, though, again, is that they're showing this kind of complex spatial ability and expectations, and it's all a form of, problem solving. Now we'll get to some of the stuff we also see, back in these early days of problem solving research on humans. So here are two different problems. So on the left, we have a problem here. We are given this little matchbox full of matches, a couple of candles and some thumbtacks, and we are told that we need to find a way to mount these candles on the wall, like we're making a little lamp, sconce attached to the wall, right? And we're given these tools, and so people think, okay, well, one thing I can do is I can try to attack the candle directly to the wall, press the tack through the candle. But what happens is that the length of the needle part of the tack is not long enough. It doesn't go all the way through the candle. And if you force it, you're just going to crush the candle. So this is not going to work, right? Um, and so after trying a few variations of this, some people might put the tacks into the wall side by side, close together. So if they're close enough to each other, the candle might be able to sit on top of them. It doesn't really work out very well either. So eventually, people might give up and say, "I can't figure this out." But sometimes people do figure out a solution, which is you have to look at this matchbox again because we think the function of the matches here is to be able to light the candle when we're done, right? But of course, if we pull that inner sleeve that has the little open box that holds the matches, we dump the matches out, we can use the tacks to attach that thing to the wall. And then we can set the candle into that and light it, and we've achieved our goal, right? But this requires that we have to think about the purpose and the function of the matchbox in slightly different terms than what we would normally do. Now, in a similar vein here, on the bottom right, we have a person whose task is to tie these two strings together. But as you can see, the two strings are too far apart. They are given this chair, and you can kind of see there a pair of pliers laying on the floor. And so what's happening now is how can we achieve this if I can't uh, reach the second string, while holding onto the first string so I can tie them together. Sometimes people try to take the chair and put it in the middle and stand on it as if standing on the chair might make a difference, but it really doesn't. Of course, you can also take the pliers and use the pliers to extend your grasp distance by a couple of inches, right? Maybe 3 or 4 inches at most is what you're going to get here. But again, it's not enough. So again, sometimes people just sort of get stuck and they're like, I don't know how to proceed. The solution is you need to tie the pliers. The chair really is no help here, really. Tie the pliers to the end of one of the strings, and then set it swinging like a pendulum, and then go grab the other string, come back to the center, and then wait for the pliers to swing back at you, and then you can catch them, and now you have both strings in hand and you can tie them together, right? So again, it requires us to imagine using the pliers for some function other than what we normally would use them for, which is as a gripping tool. So this research and the fact that people struggle to solve these problems, right? They don't always completely fail, but the point is that they struggle. They try a variety of other approaches that don't work, and they can tend to be somewhat slow at solving what might otherwise be considered a fairly simple problem to solve. So the fact that people struggle with it because we're trying to use these tools for non-typical purposes is called functional fixedness, right? Which means that we get fixed or fixated on the typical function of our tools. And then when it requires that we use it for a atypical purpose, that's when it takes a little bit of extra time. So we would say here is that the use of prior experiences is what we might call reproductive thinking, that I'm trying to I know that pliers are for grasping. I know that tacks are for tacking things, and that a matchbox is for holding matches, not necessarily other things. So that's all reproductive thinking, but it's not actually useful here. But what we're looking at is the fact that that reproductive prior experience is actually now interfering with our ability to come up with a novel approach to the problem, which would involve productive thinking, right? So prior experience getting in our way is sometimes a problem, and that also shows up in this other task. So this is, we could call this the water jug problem, if you will. So here's the idea, right? You're given two, maybe three jars of water that are specified in terms of how much liquid they contain. And your task is to obtain a certain amount of liquid in one of the jars, but you're only allowed to fill the jars to the top when you are doing this. So let's look at the first problem, which is fairly simple. I have jar A that contains 29 liters or can hold 29 liters of water. jar B can hold 3 liters of water, and my task is to achieve some jar that contains exactly 20 liters. So one way to do this would be, this is the wrong way to do it, right? Which is I could fill jar B up one time, it holds 3 liters, and then I can pour that amount into jar A. So now jar A has 3 liters in it. And I could do this 6 times, and then jar A will have 18 liters in it, right? But what happens with jar B? Can I fill jar B just 2/3 of the way, right, with 2 liters so I can top off A to get 20? No, that's not allowed, right? I'm not allowed to do that. So if I fill jar B a seventh time, that's going to take us to 21, and we're going to miss. But there's a simpler way to do this, right? I fill jar A all the way to the top, 29 liters, and then I fill jar B by pouring out of A it 3 liters, right? And then A goes down to 26. And if I do that again, A goes down to 23. And if I do it one more time, A goes down to 20. And I have solved the problem. I have 20 liters in jar A. So problem 2 is a little bit more complex. But now that we have an idea about filling one up and then pouring out of that bottle into one of the other bottles, we can start to approach a solution here. So if I think, okay, what happens if I fill my goal? My new goal is to obtain 100 liters, and I have jar A that holds 21, jar B holds 127, jar C holds 3. So I have a really useful solution I think I can figure out pretty quickly, right? I fill jar B all the way, and so that now I have 127 liters. If I empty it into jar A, that takes me down to 106. And now jar C holds 3 liters. So if I empty it twice into jar C, that's going to take me down to 100. And then I go on to problem 3. And it turns out problem 3 has a very similar solution, that if I take jar B and fill it up to 163 and then subtract out the 14, that gives me 149 liters in jar B. And then if I empty it into jar C, which holds 25, and I do that twice, that takes me down to the 99 liters. So again, I keep going, and I notice that this approach works for problem 4. So I'm cool, okay. And I can keep on going. But critically here, what happens when I get to problem 7? Well, problem 7, my strategy, which is written down at the bottom here, B minus A minus 2C, a formula that I've developed from problems 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Well, it works, and I get all the way to problem 7, and it still works, right? But notice there's a simpler solution. It would be much easier to skip all of that and just fill up jar A to 23 and then empty it once into C, and then I'm going to have my 20. All right, so A minus C is a simpler process than the B minus A minus 2C. But what we're looking at here is that when people go through the series of problems 1 through 6, and then when they get to problem 7, they persist with the inefficient solution and they fail to notice the more easy solution. That also happens with problem 8 here as well, and also 9. But what's critical here is that if you do the math for problem 9, B minus A minus 2C actually don't work. So then what happens is people get stuck, right? They're like, oh, the formula doesn't work. Now I don't have the right amount of 25 liters anymore. And so they're a little slow to recognize that if they do the A minus C approach, it would work a whole lot better, right? And it would be relatively easy. And what's important here is that if people are presented with problem 9 as the very first problem, rather than the last problem on the list, they solve it quickly, right? But when it's presented as the 9th problem after they've mastered the B minus A minus 2C approach, now they struggle a little bit with it. So again, that shows that our prior experience is interfering with our productive thinking. This research, by the way, is referred to as the mental set, because what's happening here is that you get set in your ways, right? And so you develop this set way of solving the problem, and that's how you approach every new problem and new variant that you encounter. But what happens is that when the problems change, you're going to have to break out of that pattern, and people are going to struggle with it a little bit. Okay, now the next set of this deals with a different version of things where we move into more of the cognitive side of things and talk about sort of an information processing approach to solving problems. But I think that would make for a perfectly good separate video. So we'll go ahead and stop this one here as well. And we will then finish up these notes with one more video talking about the information processing approach. See you then.